So what I want to do here quickly is just kind of give you an example of some different things to think about. Oop. So I'm basically just redrawing the same diagram here. Okay, so with our IS curve, this was our initial increase in output and our initial increase in interest rates. And because interest rates go up, there's potentially a bad... Let's say the increase in government spending is not as effective as it could be because some investment spending is crowded out. What if instead of having this upward sloping LM curve, we basically had... Oh, that's not what I wanted. We had a perfectly inelastic LM curve. So what if our LM curve was vertical? We have an increase in IS. What ends up happening? What is our increase in output when we increase government spending? Sorry? There is no change in output, and what happens to interest rates? What we have in that situation is there's an increase in government spending and an equal but opposite decrease in investment spending. Government spending completely crowds out, the increase in government spending is completely crowded out, right? By a decrease in investment spending. In other words, with a vertical LM curve, the increase in government spending, which shifts the IS curve, leads to the only effect is an increase in interest rates, which decreases investment spending. And investment spending just decreases until we are back to the original level of output. So what would that imply about an increase in government spending if we had a vertical LM curve? Does an expansionary fiscal policy have any positive effects in that case? In the short run, no. In the long run, no. Right? Okay? And now, if you are thinking ahead, you might see where I'm going with this. Okay, so now I'm going to make that disappear, having now gone through all the trouble of moving it. Okay. Okay, so for my final trick, what if my LM curve was entirely horizontal, was perfectly elastic? When I increase my government spending now, what happens? Is there any increase in interest rate? There's no increase in interest rate. And what about my level of output? How has that increased? By a lot more than in my initial diagram. Yeah? In other words, if my LM curve, is perfectly elastic, there is no crowding out. There's no increase in interest rates, so there's no decrease in investment. So the increase in government spending, whatever the increase in government spending is, leads directly to an increase in output. There's no decrease in investments. So if our LM curve was perfectly horizontal, would our expansionary fiscal policy be a good thing? I mean, is there any potential negative effect that you can see there? And it leads to an increase in output. That's good. Yeah? So the effectiveness then of an expansionary fiscal policy, as you can see, depends a lot on the slope of the LM curve. So as you can imagine, there's quite a lot of debate about what the slope of the LM curve is. Right? It's not a resolved debate. Okay? But the case of a horizontal LM curve is also what is known as a liquidity trap. And a liquidity trap just means that people will hold will basically hold any amount of money. Okay? So, with the liquidity trap, fiscal policy is a very good way to stimulate economic activity. Are you with me? If we have a very horizontal LM curve, an expansionary fiscal policy is a good way to increase output. You with me? Okay. Now remember that if maybe you do, maybe you don't, I can't remember how much we discussed it, but when we introduced the Keynesian cross diagram, the aggregate expenditure model, or maybe it was even earlier, I spoke about different time frames, a short run time frame and a long run time frame. And I mentioned that the Keynesian economics was developed around the 1930s. Did we speak about this? And Keynesian economics basically said, listen, government spending is a good thing. It helps to boost economic growth. That's what Keynesian economics was about in the 1930s. Okay? Keynesian economics said, cool, if you increase government spending, we will promote expansion of the economy. And part of the reasoning behind all of that was the assumption that the LM curve was flat. The reasoning, the assumption was the economy was in what is called a liquidity trap. Okay? And in a liquidity trap, when you increase the money supply, in other words, you try and use an expansionary monetary policy, nothing happens. You cannot increase output. When you have a horizontal LM curve, let me put it to you this way. If you have an LM curve that that is upward sloping, okay, so if we draw a normal LM curve, so we've got y against r, and we have an LM curve that's upward sloping. Remember, when you shift your LM curve to the right, that's an expansionary monetary policy, right? Now, if your LM curve is much flatter, when you shift your LM curve by the same amount, okay, and if your LM curve is perfectly horizontal, when you shift it horizontally, it stays in the same place. Right? You get what I'm saying? Okay? So when you have a liquidity trap, you shift your LM curve to the right, well, it's horizontal and it just kind of moves more to the right. Right? It doesn't have any effect on your economy. So when you have a liquidity trap, you try and use monetary policy, what's the result? Nothing. So part of the discussion at the time was, well, if you're in a liquidity trap, what do? Keynes said, well, why don't we increase government spending? Government spending is going to be a very good way to increase output. So when you have a liquidity trap, you have a very horizontal LM curve, what should you do? Fiscal policy, if you want to try and promote economic growth. What about if you have a vertical LM curve? Does fiscal policy work when you have a vertical LM curve? No. But what happens if you use expansionary monetary policy? That's what I would like you to draw now quickly. Okay? So, draw yourself an ISLM diagram with a vertical LM curve. Okay, so it's perfectly inelastic. And then, illustrate what happens when you use expansionary monetary policy. And compare those results to expansionary fiscal policy. So if you have an LM diagram with a perfectly inelastic LM curve, show what happens when you use fiscal policy, expansionary fiscal policy, and then show what happens when you use expansionary monetary policy. Compare those two results. Okay? I'll come up there quickly and take a look. Okay. Are you happy? Let's draw it quickly. When we have, sorry, wrong color. When we have an ISLM setup, so we're plotting Y against R, we have a vertical LM, doesn't look vertical. We have a vertical LM curve, and we have a normal downward sloping IS curve. Okay? If we shift our IS curve because we have an expansionary fiscal policy, what happens? We don't have any change in output, but we have a change in interest rates. So any increase, any fiscal policy action is just totally crowded out. On the other hand, if instead of shifting the IS curve, we shift the LM curve, goodness gracious, the LM curve, so we have an expansionary monetary policy, what do we end up with? A decrease in interest rates and a massive increase in output. The entire increase in money supply gets translated into an increase in output. Why? Because the decrease in interest rates leads to an increase in investment spending. We move down along our IS curve to a new point of equilibrium at a higher level of output. Okay? So if our LM curve is vertical, fiscal policy doesn't work, but monetary policy does work. So the more inelastic the LM curve, the more inelastic the LM curve, the better monetary policy is, right, at changing output. The more inelastic the LM curve, the better monetary policy is at changing output. The more elastic the LM curve is, the better fiscal policy is at changing output. Right? Are you with me? Now I have another question for you which you can take home and do at home. What I've just told you was the relationship between the elasticity of the LM curve and the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policy. What I want to know is, what about the effectiveness of fiscal and monetary policy? How is it related to the elasticity of the IS curve? Think about different elasticities for the IS curve, and then think about how effective monetary or fiscal policy is. Okay? So I'll write it down quickly just to remind you what the question is. How is the effectiveness of both fiscal policy and monetary policy influenced by the elasticity of the IS curve? How is the effectiveness of fiscal and monetary policy influenced by the elasticity of the IS curve? That's my question for you. You can do it for your homework and come and chat to me whenever you want to about it. So if you want to do some extra stuff, there's some extra stuff for you to do. Okay? I know how much you guys love doing extra stuff. What? No? Okay. final part of the ISLM curve, which takes us into the next chapter being chapter 28. Chapter 28 is about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now, remember that we already derived an aggregate demand curve. We derived an aggregate demand curve from the aggregate expenditure model. Do you remember that? When we change prices, it affects aggregate expenditure. Do you remember that? Not really? Okay, there's a lot of scribbles there, which maybe makes it a little bit difficult, but okay. Do you remember from our aggregate expenditure diagram that if we start at some price level, so if we're starting here at AE0, aggregate expenditure level 0, okay, and the price level is 110, when the price level decreases, so we're changing from price level 110 to price level 90, when the price level decreases, what happens to the real value of any nominal wealth that you are holding? The price level, the general price level goes down, the value of your wealth goes up. When the value of your wealth goes up, what do? It's like winning the lottery. What do? Or when you get 14 million rand deposited into your account, what do? That's right. You throw the biggest house party and you buy the fanciest stuff. And then when the media gets hold of it, they track down your grandmother who berates you for not buying her a house. You got 14 million rand and you're not buying me a house. That was all she had to say about it. She was like, that one. And to be fair, on her grandmother, I totally agree. Anyway, when the price level decreases, the value of your wealth goes up. When the value of your wealth goes up, it's Christmas come early, you spend. Okay? When you spend, what happens to your aggregate expenditure? It increases. Your aggregate expenditure curve shifts upwards, and your equilibrium level of outputs increases. So when the price level goes down, spending goes up. So our aggregate demand curve is an inverse relationship between price level and spending. When the price level goes down, we demand more goods and services. We want to buy more goods and services. And the new level of equilibrium, in other words, the point of the output level where we're earning enough income to finance that expenditure, is a higher level of output. So the relationship between aggregate demand and price level is inverse. As real GDP goes up, as price level goes down, we want to spend more, and real GDP goes up in terms of aggregate demand. Okay? So our relationship is inverse. And we derived that from the aggregate expenditure model just by itself. Okay? Now we're going to look at something slightly different. We're going to look at the ISLM diagram, and we're going to say, well, hang on a minute. What happens to the price level? When the price level changes, we've already seen kind of what happens in the aggregate expenditure diagram. But what happens in our money market when the price level goes up? Okay? I'm going to go back a few slides to make you think about it here. When the price level goes up, what is affected? Real money demand or real money supply? Real money supply. When the price level goes up, what happens? What happens to real money supply? Price level goes up. What happens to the real value of your money? The real value of your money goes down when the price level goes up. If the real value of your money is going down, what does that mean about the real purchasing power of your money supply? The money supply is fixed, but the price has gone up. So the real purchasing power of that money supply has decreased. It's as if your actual real money supply has decreased, shifted to the left. This is an increase in price level. What about a decrease in the price level? What does the decrease in price level do to your effective money supply? It's as if your real money supply has increased. Why? Because when the price level goes down, the purchasing power of your money has now increased. You can now buy more goods and services with your money. It's as if you had more real money, right? Your money supply increases when the price level goes down. Now, what happens when the money supply shifts to the right? What happens to our LM curve? Our LM curve shifts to the right if prices go down. Are you with me? Are you following me? Yes. No. Not really. Okay? Are you happy that if the money supply shifts to the right, the LM curve shifts to the right? Are you happy with that? Money supply shifts to the right. Well, from your perspective, money supply shifts to the right. LM curve shifts to the right. Okay? And now I'm telling you that if the price level decreases, then the real purchasing power of your money supply increases. It's as if your real money supply has increased. Remember, real money supply is M over P. That's what real money supply is as a measure. M, nominal money supply, divided by price level. So if my price level goes down, what's happening to my real money supply? It's going up. So a decrease in the price level shifts my real money supply to the right. Sorry, from your perspective, to the right. If it's shifting real money supply to the right, what's happening to the LM curve? It's shifting to the right. Excellent. So, if at some price level, we've got an initial price level 105, we have some LM curve. If I increase my price level, what happens to my LM curve? It shifts to the left. I increase my price level, my money supply shifts to the left. Increase price level, money supply shifts to the left. If money supply shifts to the left, LM curve shifts to the left. So my price level goes up. What happens to my equilibrium in my LM curve? In my ISLM diagram. What happens to equilibrium? Well, it moves from point E to point J. What happens to the interest rate? It goes up. What happens to the level of output? It decreases. In other words, if I plot equilibrium in my ISLM diagram at different price levels, I see that when I increase the price level, my equilibrium level of output decreases. So I move from an initial equilibrium E, so there's some level of output that was equilibrium E, then I raise the price level. When I raise the price level, my LM curve shifts to the left. When my LM curve shifts to the left, I move from equilibrium level E to equilibrium level J. Equilibrium level J has a lower level of output. Therefore, with a higher price level, I have a lower level of equilibrium output. If I lower my price level from initial level E, what happens to my LM curve? It shifts to the right, and my output increases. So I move from E to K. And if I join all these points, which show the relationship between the price level and equilibrium real GDP in my ISLM model, I have a downward sloping relationship, which is the aggregate demand relationship. Why? Because it's showing me different levels of equilibrium expenditure, right, at different price levels. As the price level has changed, my equilibrium level of expenditure has changed. But what the ISLM model is telling me is that at each point along that aggregate demand curve, both the aggregate expenditure model, so the goods market, and the money market are in equilibrium. That's crazy. We now have one curve, the AD curve, which gives us all points of equilibrium of IS and LM at different price levels. So the AD curve summarizes equilibrium in the money market and the goods market at different price levels. There's a lot more moving parts, and we still haven't added all of them in, right? That's just aggregate demand. We haven't put aggregate supply in yet, okay? It's gonna get real, right? You want 1 minute just to kind of digest that? Just look at that, think about it. Yeah, we still got 20 minutes. Yeah. Okay. It's all the points of equilibrium in our ISLM model at different price levels. And remember, every point of equilibrium in the ISLM model is a point of equilibrium in the goods market and a point of equilibrium in the money market. Okay. Now we still got 15 minutes to go. So, okay. There are two ways that we derive the aggregate demand curve. Two ways. One way was just looking at the aggregate expenditure model. The other way was looking at the ISLM model, which also includes the money market. The money market and the ISLM model shows us what happens to interest rates, which the aggregate expenditure model does not show us. Okay? What we're going to see in the next chapter, when we look at the slope of the AD curve, the slope of the AD curve is downward sloping because of two reasons. There's one called a wealth effect, and there's another called the substitution effect. Okay? The wealth effect is kind of what we showed when we just look at the aggregate expenditure model. Change in prices changes wealth. That's a wealth effect. The substitution effect is what happens when you have a change in interest rates. Because the change in interest rates changes the relative cost of purchasing today versus purchasing tomorrow. Okay? When you change interest rates, there's a time between your purchases. So you decide, do I want to consume today, or would I rather consume tomorrow? That's the substitution effect. And the substitution effect is shown in our ISLM diagram. Okay? So we derive the AD model in two different ways, and there's two different effects. A substitution effect and a wealth effect, which we can see independently in these two different derivations. So we derive our AD model. That's the end of our ISLM. Fantastic.